So what you'll see, if you were to come to the exhibit on the early women of architecture in Maryland, is 3 rooms that showcase the work of 12 women. We start out in the large room where we give a little background on Maryland and key points that happened during women's development in the field. And then we have the first woman in the exhibit, which is Rose Greeley. And she was actually more of a landscape architect, but she is the first woman to be registered in Washington, D.C., and has a number of projects in Maryland. And Hildreth Marier never became an architect, but she influenced over 64 buildings throughout the U.S., including some you may recognize, the Great Dome in the National Academy of Sciences. And then Gertrude Sawyer, who was the second woman in Maryland to become registered as an architect. Ida Brown Webster, who was actually a New York architect, but she did a wonderful building in Owens Mills that rival any structure done by the men of her day. And we move over into the second room. So this mansion is gorgeous in and of itself, designed by Wayne Nolting. And we have the next woman. We were doing these in order of their birth year. Victorian DuPont Homsey, who had a firm with her husband, who was also an architect, that started right during the Depression. And yet they were able to do quite a number of projects in Maryland. I think I've had up to 24, though they were Delaware architects primarily. They had a firm in Wilmington, Delaware. And Clothiel Woodward Smith, who had one of the largest architecture firms in Washington, D.C., and had lots of work in Maryland. And so we have her, followed by Catherine Cutler Ficken. She, her father was an architect. And so even though she was born after Clothiel, and she tends to be old school, but Catherine was actually the first woman to be registered in Maryland the same year registration was offered, which is 1935. One of the things that Hartford County can be proud of is Polly Hirsch. She is actually the first woman in the AIA, with the American Institute of Architects, that's what it stands for, Baltimore chapter, who had her own firm. And she has over 24 buildings in Harbor de Grace that still exist that were her creation. And on display is also some of the designs of those spaces. So you can see her earlier sketches. Here's the Hartford Jewish Center, which actually never was built quite in her vision. It was more modern than people could accept at the time. And then we have one remaining room. And that's the 4 last women in the exhibit. We have Melita Roderick, and we know of her work because she actually gave a lot of her pieces to a collection down in Virginia that is an international Women of Architecture archives. And then Helen Ross Staley, who actually is still living, and she's living in North Carolina. And here's a wonderful project she did that still exists today, Herondale Presbyterian Church. And Mary Crago, she actually didn't have her own firm, but she worked for NIH and basically reviewed and buildings all over the US. And Shirley Kennard, who passed away actually since this exhibit was put together. But she and her husband, who was also an architect, had a lot of projects, a lot of residential particularly, all around the Washington, D.C. area and the Maryland metropolitan area around D.C. primarily. And so those are the 12 women that are in the exhibit, and it's a very lovely place to come visit because it's also, you have the architecture of the liriodendron, which is dendron, as I understand. Everybody likes to pronounce it wrong, but it's still a very gorgeous place to come see this exhibit.